War, land, gold, trouble. On April 25, 1846, Mexican soldiers splashed across the Rio Grande and attacked a small group of American troops. 16 Americans were killed and the rest captured. Hostilities have commenced, General Taylor wrote to President Polk. When the letter reached Washington, it took a couple of weeks, Polk immediately went to Congress to demand a declaration of war. Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, he said, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil. Cause for war? Had the shooting really started in American territory? Some members of Congress didn't think so. That soil was not ours, said a little-known House member from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. To Lincoln, it looked like Polk had purposefully sent American soldiers into the disputed territory in order to spark a war with Mexico. The war would give the United States an excuse to capture the land Mexico had refused to sell. Pretty rotten, thought Senator Alexander Stephens of Georgia. The principle of waging war against a neighboring people to compel them to sell their country is not only dishonorable, but disgraceful. Polk objected, pointing out that Mexico had started the shooting. He had always wanted peace with Mexico, he insisted. His opponents joked that what Polk really wanted was not peace with Mexico, but a peace of Mexico. Either way, the public was on Polk's side. American soldiers had been attacked, and there was strong support for war. Congress voted to declare war on Mexico in May 1846. Thousands of Americans rushed to volunteer for military service. As for Abraham Lincoln, he soon heard from angry voters back home who said his opposition to the war was pretty much an act of treason. One Illinois newspaper actually called him a second Benedict Arnold. That was the end of Lincoln's political career, experts said. Santa Anna does it again. Mexico should fight to the end, declared a newspaper in the Mexican city of Nuevo León. As long as there is one man remaining, he should go and fight the unjust invaders. The problem with this plan, the Mexican army was in awful shape. Most Mexican soldiers had very little training and terrible equipment, including old-fashioned muskets sold to them by the British, left over from wars Britain had fought 30 years ago. The army could not even have survived without soldaderas, women who traveled along with the troops and did work the army should have done, cooking, making uniforms, caring for the sick and wounded. Another serious problem was that the Mexican army was led by General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, the self-proclaimed genius who had lost Texas. Santa Anna was good at talking, though, not so good at actual fighting. When his army faced Americans at the Battle of Buena Vista in the early 1847, Santa Anna demanded that the Americans surrender in order to save themselves. "Tell Santa Anna to go to censored," barked Zachary Taylor. Then Taylor turned to a staff member and said, "Major Bliss, put that in Spanish and send it back." Bliss put Taylor's main idea into slightly more polite language. "I beg leave to say that I decline acceding to your request." Santa Anna attacked, lost 5 times more men than the Americans, and declared victory. Then he retreated. In a series of short, brutal battles in the spring and summer of 1847, the American army continued slashing its way toward Mexico City. Meanwhile, the war with Mexico gave Polk an excuse to do something he'd wanted to do anyway: send American troops to capture California. Is that supposed to be a bear? Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo woke suddenly on the morning of June 14, 1846, startled by the sounds of shouts and horses. "I looked out of my bedroom window," Vallejo said. "To my great surprise, I made out groups of armed men scattered to the right and left of my residence." As Mexico's military commander in Northern California, and uncle to the young pioneer on page 44, Vallejo had always been welcoming to American immigrants. He often invited newcomers to stay at his large ranch in Sonoma and help them settle in California. But that did him no good when armed Americans banged on his door. "My wife advised me to try and flee by the rear door," Vallejo remembered, "but I told her that such a step was unworthy and that under no circumstances could I decide to desert my young family at such a critical time." He jumped into his general's uniform and opened his door. The house was immediately filled with armed men, he said. These weren't Polk soldiers, just regular guys with guns wearing greasy clothes and very dirty hats. They were about as rough-looking a set of men as one could well imagine, admitted Robert Semple, one of the Americans. Too polite to say what he was really thinking, Vallejo asked, "To what happy circumstances shall I attribute the visit of so many exalted personages?" Shouting all at once, the Americans declared that they were there to arrest Vallejo. They were seizing California from Mexico, and while they were at it, they seized Vallejo's brandy and drowned it in a quick gulps. Then the Americans marched to the town plaza in Sonoma, declared California to be an independent republic, and raised a homemade flag on which they had painted a grizzly bear. Well, it was supposed to be a bear. The bear was so badly painted, Vallejo said, it looked more like a pig than a bear. Anyway, the key point is that these Americans had heard that the United States was at war with Mexico. They decided it was a good time to seize California for their country. A few weeks later, the American soldiers and sailors sent by President Polk started arriving. They took control of California for the United States. Redraw the map again. In September 1847, American soldiers captured Mexico City. Having lost the war, Mexican leaders were forced to accept the same basic deal they had angrily rejected 2 years before. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico gave up nearly half its territory, including the disputed land in Texas, all of California, New Mexico, and the rest of what is now the southwestern United States. The United States paid Mexico $15 million. Now, all the land we think of as the West today was part of the United States. More settlers. While all this was going on, more and more Americans were showing up in the West. Followers of the new Mormon religion even established their own Western Trail. After getting violently chased out of towns in Missouri and Illinois, the Mormons were looking for a new place to settle. The Mormon leader Brigham Young read about the Great Salt Lake Valley, a giant salty lake surrounded by deserts. It sounded like a good place to be left alone. In the spring of 1847, Young and his followers established the Mormon Trail, a 1,300-mile route from Illinois to what is now Utah. When the travelers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, they were not impressed. "A paradise of the lizard, the cricket, and the rattlesnake," one settler said. That was fine by Brigham Young. "I want hard times so that every person that does not wish to stay for the sake of his religion will leave." Brigham Young. The Mormon settlers began irrigating fields, planting crops, building homes, and laying out the streets of a new town. It took them just a few years to turn Salt Lake City into the second largest city west of Missouri. Only San Francisco was bigger. And more trouble. Meanwhile, thousands of other Americans were heading west, most of them on the Oregon Trail. When they arrived in Oregon, many travelers stopped to rest at the home of Narcissa and Marcus Whitman. Remember them? They're the missionaries who had settled in Oregon and taken in the orphan Sager children. The Cayuse and other Indians of the region watched this migration with growing alarm. 10 years before, Cayuse leaders had invited the Whitmans to settle on their land. The Whitmans told them they were there to teach and help the local people, but now the Whitmans were using their house as a welcome station for huge groups of white settlers. This was not at all what the Cayuse had agreed to. The poor Indians are amazed at the overwhelming numbers of Americans coming into the country, Narcissa Whitman wrote. They had good reason to be amazed, and angry too. The new settlers not only grabbed big chunks of land, but they also brought diseases that had not existed in that part of the world. Measles, for example, was not very dangerous for people of European background. They had developed natural defenses to it over many centuries. But when American settlers brought measles to Oregon in 1847, the disease quickly killed half the people in many Cayuse villages, and nearly all of the children. Unable to escape from this nightmare, some Cayuse began wondering, how come Marcus Whitman, who is a doctor, is able to cure most of the white children, while our own children continue to die? A rumor started spreading that the Whitmans were purposefully using the disease to wipe the Cayuse out. The disease was raging fearfully among the Indians, who were rapidly dying, said Catherine Sager. "I saw from 5 to 6 buried daily." 4 years earlier, Catherine had watched her parents die on the Oregon Trail. Now she was 13 and in for another horrible shock. The Whitman Massacre. The morning of November 29th was foggy and cold. Catherine Sager remembered. She was at home with the Whitmans, helping to care for sick children. There was a sudden burst of banging on the front door. Outside, pounding with his fists, was a Cayuse chief named Tulucaquit, along with several other Cayuse men. Tulucaquit had just seen 3 of his children die of measles. Now he was shouting for Dr. Whitman to let him in and give him medicine for other sick children. Marcus Whitman let the men into the kitchen. Catherine, who was in the living room with Narcissa Whitman, heard angry yelling. Suddenly there was a sharp explosion, she said. A rifle shot in the kitchen, and we all jumped in fright. Moments later, a girl named Mary Ann stumbled into the room. "Did they kill the doctor?" Narcissa cried. Panting and pale with shock, Mary Ann managed to say, "Yes." "My husband is killed and I am left a widow," wailed Narcissa. Through the living room window, Catherine could see Cayuse men attacking other settlers in nearby buildings. Then a bullet came through the window, piercing Mrs. Whitman's shoulder, Catherine said. Clasping her hands to the wound, she shrieked with pain and then fell to the floor. I ran to her and tried to raise her up. "Child, you cannot help me. Save yourself," Narcissa told Catherine. Catherine helped carry her younger sisters and 2 other girls up to the attic where they hid until dark. Several of the girls were sick with measles and they called out desperately for water. Catherine could not help them. Finally, they passed out from exhaustion. The attic grew quiet. I sat upon the side of the bed, said Catherine, watching hour after hour while the horrors of the day passed and repassed before my mind. She heard the clock downstairs strike 10, then 11, then midnight. She listened to the steady breathing of the sleeping children and the sounds of cats' paws on the floor downstairs. Catherine and her sisters survived that terrible night, but Tulu-Kakt and his men had killed the Whitmans and 11 other settlers, including 2 of Catherine's brothers. Calling for vengeance, white settlers formed armed groups and attacked Cayuse villages, killing many people who had nothing to do with the crime. Tulu-Kakt finally turned himself in. He and 4 other Cayuse men were tried for murder, found guilty, and hanged. Between the measles epidemic and the attacks following the Whitman massacre, the Cayuse were nearly destroyed. Survivors went to live with other Native American groups, and Catherine Sager was an orphan again. She and her sisters split up, moving in with different families in the Oregon Territory. A bloody preview? Violent clashes like those between the Cayuse and white settlers in Oregon didn't happen every day, of course, but the Whitman massacre is an important story because it shows how tense things could get when large numbers of settlers started moving onto Native American lands, and it shows just how quickly those tensions could explode into violence. Can you imagine what might happen if tens of thousands of settlers suddenly raced to the west? You're about to find out.